Welcome to the Prana and Poetry Pod, Episode 7, Decolonizing Your Spiritual Business, Part 2. Anger is a gift for change, a catalyst for seeking justice. It is the spark behind a silenced voice and the protection of one's spirit. It is action. Through anger, one begins the journey on the path of the warrior. I left part 1 with some pointers on how to lead a spiritual business that's built on indigenous culture responsibly. I just want to clarify that I don't actually enjoy feeling angry and frustrated. I wish I could blissfully spend all my time engaged in my own cultural practices, but there's that pesky colonial trauma. Teaching a distorted version of indigenous traditions is a privilege of the supremacist culture with its warped colonial psyche. I wish I could spend all my time in healing through my own indigenous medicine. Instead, as a protector of dharma, I have to disrupt the harm by spending my time and energy on this. By the way, I congratulate Hindu creators who I see online, some of whom are way younger than me, I might add, in speaking on these issues. It makes me so proud that finally there is a collective voice emerging. We are no longer going to tolerate abuse or accept the colonized education and the self-loathing it was designed to create that made us feel ashamed of our own dharma. Dharma that the colonizer is now unashamedly using for their spiritual businesses. It's quite a farce. Please see episode 3 and 4 of this podcast series for more about this circus. Moving on, in order to dismantle a colonialist business, ask the following questions. Am I centering myself, my personal opinions, based on previous conditioning, Western ideas about the spiritual practice I'm participating in? Or am I centering the indigenous teaching itself, the teachings preserved through time by stewards of the tradition? Who works for me? Do I have adequate cultural representation and not superficial tokens to make my business seem more legit? How am I making my offerings accessible to the indigenous community whose practices I'm using to make my sales? I'll add that before selling your offer to the indigenous carrier of the culture, make sure your teachings are not watered down and misinformed. That would be criminal, as this is already happening. Indians are being sold back by the West the repackaged version of their sacred medicine. Not acknowledging the cultural source is a play of the ego and reveals a lack of humility. Recently, I was browsing some podcasts and I found ones on dharma by people who can't even pronounce the term. Expecting to hear some valuable information and good education, instead I get the usual nonsense, proving that this person isn't even qualified to talk about yoga or dharma. If you don't get that yoga is part of sanatana dharma, not a 60-minute workout, if you can't even understand this, then you have to come as a blank state and get the proper lineage training so you don't, as a result of poor, weaponized knowledge, harm the carriers of the culture through your gaslighting. All I hear is colonized people trying to find loopholes and excuses as to why they can continue to recolonize and butcher the tradition's sacredness, saying things like, yoga isn't a Hindu-specific practice, it's cultural. God, stuck in these Western binaries of religion and culture and science and spirituality, which is quite literally a mindfuck for those of us from the original culture, the Sanatanis. The following words like superstitions, dogmas, religion, these are all Western or even Abrahamic ideologies and concoctions, and to implant this framework onto an indigenous epistemology is lazy at best, deeply ignorant and contributing to ethnocide at worst. And much, much worse and cruel is the continued Hinduphobia perpetuated in casual conversations, which lead to real consequences like genocide, which is still happening to Hindus right now. What I hear on this particular podcast I just listened to, and others I've heard in the past, is just the usual entitlement. And this is my personal experience, so I'm going to do what I want to whoever's cultural tradition. Again, when it comes to spiritual business, the best advice is don't teach or speak on what you don't know. Don't share personal opinions on a fully developed and rich culture that you don't understand and have no experience of by way of the people, the customs, the understanding of yoga from yoga's perspective or the culture's perspective. Share your authenticity by all means, not your sense of entitlement to erase and destroy and bastardize, which is the colonizer mentality. My work and my words are primarily for those who identify as highly sensitive, because it is that kind, kindred soul who has deep empathy that can hear me. I know for a fact that the colonizers won't be able to hear me, or the native voice, as much as I wish these disembodied people could hear me, because they are mostly the ones perpetrating the harm. It will only be the highly sensitive, deeply intuitive and gifted individual that will be open to listening, as their whole existence is to do no harm, to facilitate spaces where others can begin their own healing. It is the highly sensitive person that will support positive change and collaborate to make the world a safer place for all. Most of us highly sensitive people who have or are starting their own businesses usually start out with a side hustle because the 9-to-5 matrix world is just too toxic to their natures. Most of us will go into a spiritual, creative business because our purpose is rooted in impact and the creation of a kind, safe, and loving world. Inevitably, it will be this demographic that has the compassion, empathy, intellectual and emotional intelligence to understand the plight of the indigenous cultures and do their best to uncolonize themselves so as to not create yet another colonialist business, which the world does not need. We don't need self-serving people. We need impact-driven souls. We need empathy, purity in heart, a warrior's spirit, and a community of collaborators who replace the harm done with good. The best place we can start is with our own bodies and minds and emotional well-being. Sick people can't heal and support sick people. Narcissism is a mental sickness. At the foundation of a colonial business is narcissism. A scary thought, because a narcissist does not care for the other. Their main interest is exploitation and extraction. On the other side of the coin exists the empath, who can also unwittingly be a toxic entity. The key is to move towards self-sovereignty, surpass the mental sickness and become healthy. Mental, emotional, and spiritual hygiene is so important, especially on the yogic path. An adhikari is someone who is accepted onto the path of yoga, a person qualified by a lineage because they have certain qualities. I would say healthy qualities, which mean they have the awareness and agency to make sure that harm is not being done because of them, because of a lazy teaching or a biased mind. Objectivity and discrimination is required, as is humility and integrity. If we are to have a business based on yoga, isn't it obvious that we must first cultivate these qualities so that we have a strong and healthy foundation to begin with? The worst harm, I feel, is actually done by those originating from the culture itself, those who have yet to uncolonize and dismantle their biased thinking and mindset, which is conditioned in Western race and caste-based ideologies and theories. Note I said theories. I'm not referring to the reality, because until there is a sense of self-sovereignty developed by one's own healing, unlearning and uncolonizing of the body and mind, the native person is going to continue to be the colonizer in their own culture and practices. It's so painful seeing your own people lost in the mental sickness of the colonizer. To these folks, I'd say focus instead on your own self-sovereignty, because your colonized and appropriated teachings and programs are going to poison other minds instead of liberating them. I've come across programs that a lot of white yoga teachers love because it puts the blame of social injustice on Brahmins or on Sanskrit. It gives them permission to continue their harmful yoga businesses that are built on half-baked, misinformed understandings, if not deliberately maligned ideas about Hindu culture, its people and its customs. But yoga's not Hindu. It's a culture, isn't it? Literally, this is a sentence I heard on that podcast recently. Yoga not of the Hindus, not of sanatana dharma. It's the biggest, most epic joke I've ever heard. Go do one. The gaslighting is sickening, absolutely sickening. The appropriation and deliberate erasure has played out through time because we as Hindus are very kind indeed. Live and let live is at the foundation of how we think. People say that, Hinduism is quite tolerant. Bullshit. We don't have a concept of tolerance because we don't behave, keyword behave, in ways that show that you have to have this path only. You can only do this, worship this, pray to this. Sanatana Dharma teaches that there are many paths that lead to the ultimate outcome. A reverence to a deity on a particular path, or even a atheistic outlook, is also a truth for someone from the dharmic fold. All paths will eventually lead to the same goal, and yoga's goal is moksha. For us, there is nothing to quote tolerate, nothing to quote worship. These are Western and Abrahamic beliefs. Please don't assume we think the same. We clearly do not. It's time to educate yourself and stop the erasure of knowledge systems you have no understanding about. There is no recorded history of a Hindu conquest of other lands because we truly believe that the only worthwhile pursuit is to conquer one's self. This is the path of seeking. This is the sadhana. And if you desire to learn from the source, not from more colonizers who have political or other agendas. Western epistemics distort indigenous medicine. It is violent to come from a conditioned mindset and view our scriptures and teachings from this, what I would call, fractured lens, this place of fragmentation and unwellness. You've got to be a well person if you're teaching or coaching other people and other communities. And if you're not, deconditioning, uncolonizing, and healing is the first step before basing your whole spiritual business on someone else's culture. And of course, healing is a journey, but building your own business through a colonizer mentality is just toxic towards yourself, and you're just passing that on to those who come to you for support. Spiritual bypassing is another issue with new age spiritual businesses. Unhinged people creating more unhinged people. Spiritual bypassers can be overly focused on toxic positivity. It's those love and light kind of people. People who think money doesn't matter. Those who again misinterpret Eastern traditions and notions of detachment. An example is taking a Sanskrit mantra out of context, believing you are just a spirit and not a body, therefore completely disconnecting from the wisdom of the body while you're on earth. It's not the Hindu teachings that are at fault. It is the irresponsibility of the individual who doesn't seek support and community from the source culture, from an indigenous, uncolonized teacher or steward of the tradition, taking what they like simply because they like it, and then blaming the tradition when a psychosis occurs. And please don't get me started on Kundalini yoga, a real blunder of yoga land. If you claim to be a spiritual healer, even a fitness instructor, borrowing material from other cultures and traditions, it's your responsibility to seek the truth. That is your journey, especially if you claim to be a yoga teacher or a sadhaka. It is also your responsibility to not teach what you don't know, what you have not interrogated and researched for yourself, what you have not consulted with the stewards of a particular tradition or those from the culture of origin on which you're basing your business. Who is a trustworthy source of knowledge? Who shares the right history and cultural medicine? If there is trouble identifying true indigenous sources, then believe me, the student is not ready and the teacher will not appear. What you receive is what effort you put into the receiving. This is a fruit of the sadhana itself. So when it comes to the creation of your spiritual business and using modalities from other cultures, understanding the history of the land and its people is paramount. If you're teaching yoga, it's important to learn from the indigenous people of the land, not the colonizers and invaders. Come on, it's as easy as ABC. Start with listening to indigenous voices with an open heart and mind. Connect with your heart space and your sense of empathy. If you don't know that the Aryan invasion theory, for example, has been thoroughly debunked, you're likely going to continue the colonization of Bharat and her medicine and gifts. This half-baked racist theory, by the way, was concocted by a German Indologist as a way to establish and maintain white supremacy. Because at that time, the mid-1800s, they couldn't imagine Sanatanis being the creators of a highly advanced civilization prior to the arrival of invaders. Colonizers used their own ideologies to fabricate a separate religion which they categorized as Brahmanism, which many people are weaponizing too to undermine Brahmins, the wisdom keepers and the wholeness of the dharmic way of life. God forbid Hindus reclaim their traditions. We might all just have to be kind to each other and treat all beings, including the earth, with reverence and respect. We might just have to respect and honor each other's differences, truths and paths. The horror! Some of us Hindus who speak up, and we are speaking up now, are met with aggression and gaslighting, sometimes by those who are from the Indian subcontinent themselves, yet peddling these old race-based colonizer theories, and I would add peddling them stubbornly without empathy and discernment, taking an uninformed stance and bullying those who are uncolonizing by telling them their version of history and reality is wrong. Newsflash, we have the oral tradition and the memory and wisdom of our grandmothers. Gaslighting is ineffective. Those from the source culture who internalize the empire's ideologies and propagate them are called brown sahibs. It's truly sad to witness how far they are gone into a disturbingly distorted reality. When we move towards decolonization in our spiritual businesses, we are moving towards dismantling the supremacy of the oppressor's way of thinking and being, and back to the original teachings which are already systematized and whole and developed through time and preserved through the oral tradition, which is protected by a lineage. So in order to teach what is true and authentic, learning from a lineage or an elder, a steward, and if we're lucky in this lifetime, a guru, is what is going to bear the fruits for yourself and your students. Remember, as I've mentioned in a previous episode, the guru can show up in any form, so always return to that which is organic, natural, nature. Life is always teaching if we're willing to show up courageously and listen. I've so far talked about yoga when it comes to spiritual business because this is a teaching from my own culture. I can't speak for other indigenous cultures, but I would imagine similar principles when doing business based on their tools and resources. Acknowledge what you don't know. Respect the living cultures, the people who are part of the practice's tradition and are living the practice. Hindus, for example, live yoga. It's not something we do for 60 minutes, 3 times a week. Don't assume your authority. You're a guest in someone else's culture. Respect their sensibilities and sensitivities. There are many traumas native people have suffered which can easily be activated. Being trauma-informed is essential in any business. Support their visibility in a reality that is complicit in denying them a platform and opportunities to even hold leadership and spaces in their own cultural practices because, systemic racism. Acknowledge what you don't know. Don't teach what you haven't put effort into learning, like Sanskrit. Put the effort in. Learn from a native teacher. It really shows when it's used superficially. So to decolonize your business, please do your research properly. Nothing good put out there is gained without hard work and effort. Sloppiness shows, and it is harmful and activating to those belonging to the source culture. By the way, I want to honor the teachers who are not from the heritage of sanatana dharma, yet teach with respect and integrity our Vedic knowledge, the wisdom of our deities and our pathways. These individuals exist. They honor the deconditioning and decolonization journey, and I'm truly grateful for them. Some of them have been my own coaches and mentors, and I wish that more and more people in leadership positions will wake up and take responsibility for how they are using the medicine and resources from indigenous cultures. Finally, a way to acknowledge that you're taking responsibility and showing up with integrity and the least harm is to disrupt the perpetuation of this colonizer mentality and uplift indigenous voices. So much more to say, but I'll end here for now. My name is Payal, and I thank you for joining me on this series on dharma and decoloniality. If you have any questions, send me a message. You can find me at pranaandpoetry.com. Every month I offer Vedic astrological guidance, supported by journaling tasks and other support for the yogic path. If that sounds up your alley, sign up to my newsletter or join my community online. Rise up, warrior.